morning and welcome to the Tulare County Assessment Appeals Board meeting for July 16th, 2018. My name is Lance Morris. I'll be serving as chairman today. And joining me on the panel today will be Matthew Graham. Mr. Azunian will be absent today, and in his place will be Glenn Fowler serving on the panel. We'll start with board member comments. Any comments from the board? From staff? None? Assessor? Nothing. Well, we'll get right to it. So this being is it the third Monday of July, we have in our bylaws scheduled to have our annual assessment of the tax roll meeting. And I don't see Mr. Hill here, so I think Tim's going to be filling in his place.
I am this morning. So Mr. Hill is actually, I think, in South Dakota today.
Nice.
Couldn't be with us, and so he asked me to fill in, but does send his greetings this morning to all of you. So
great.
The board's ready to go. We'll dial the lights down and kind of go over the assessment roll and let you get to your 1604 duties.
Perfect. That sounds great. Turn the time over to you.
All right, switch it. Can everyone see that clearly?
Yep.
Okay. So in effort to prepare for this morning, I generally thought obviously providing you some tax roll numbers is important to make sure that you understand what occurred this year. But sitting in there as the chief for many years, I always thought this would be a great opportunity to fill the board in on what we're doing as an organization, who we are as a group. And so I'm going to take an opportunity to very briefly this morning go through some of the organizational highlights we're working on that might explain too why we'll see, or why we're currently seeing less and less cases coming through. So maybe give you a look into the other side of what we do as a living. I'm going to cover 8 points as quickly as I can with you, so I won't belabor a lot of them. I want to go through, number one, though, who we are as an organization currently. And there's been a lot of changes in the last several years. So I'd like to kind of maybe highlight where we're at. I'd like to go through also our current workloads so you're aware. Each one of those workloads could become a potential assessment appeal, and we want to make sure you're familiar with that. We'll go through the typical role highlights, what makes it up, how much money it was, how much it went up again. But then we're also going to go through the decline in value assessments. I want to walk through what actually remains in the current assessment appeals workload that you guys will have to deal with as we have it right now. I'll touch just briefly for some of the farmers in the group on some of the Williamson Act changes that occurred this year. And then for the chairman, we'll go through and try to highlight some of the business and personal property so you know what to expect in your coming season as well. And then I thought I'd take an opportunity to touch on some legal changes that we're anticipating to occur, and one you're actually going to get to vote on in November. So we'll cover some of those, and then I'll just go through a real brief slide on where we're going as an office and some of the things we want to do this year. So given that, I'll start with some stats on who we are. So above the line is some general statistics on our staff currently. And when I came on board 15 years ago, I happened to be the youngest staff member by a decade. I am now an old dog there, which tells you something about what occurred in the last 15 years. And the real telling ones are two, the ones that I have in orange at the bottom there. Almost a third of our staff has been hired in the last 24 months. And so that anticipated turnover that you would have expected for when the baby boomers left and retired has really continued on for us. And then on top of that, with the millennials coming in, they aren't as prone to stay. So they'll come in and work 3 to 5 years, and then they'll start to move on to other jobs. The millennials being an influence, they are generally about 1/3 of our population in the office. So as you walk around there, you'll see lots of people with crazy mustaches who drink IPAs and only have things on their cell phones. The neat part about our staff, I'll tell you, these numbers are a bit deceiving because I think we all think youth means inexperience and inability. And what we've done in the last several years is move forward with a paradigm in hiring people so that we're shopping for what makes a good real estate appraiser. So we're looking for particular characteristics. And after about 8 years of that being done, we've seen some successes in the quality of staff members. So they may be young, but it's a very capable group of people. Now, below that line is the current workload that you're seeing in our office and the change in ownerships that exist. There are 5,500 of them, and that is very typical with a number of recorded documents that occur every year. That is about what you're going to see in the average workload for us. Construction's been an interesting thing because we're seeing more new homes come in, and as the economy has done well, That number has come up a little bit in the last several years. The value reviews that are there, this is really kind of an all-time low in the last 5 years for those, because we've been up as much as 50,000 properties in that value review end of things. And then for you, Ms. Morris, just in particular, the business and personal property assessments actually have started to go down. So we're seeing maybe a change in that. But some of that's going to be due to the work that Mr. Beagle's doing in that section, and we'll kind of talk about some of that in a second. So moving on to the assessment role.
Okay, quick
this
question.
year,
How does there's 35 staff now. How does that compare to the last 5 years? Is that pretty a consistent size staff?
It's been consistent. What's interesting is, so I look back prior to Prop 13, how many staff members we had in the office, and we actually had more real estate appraisers back then than we do today. So we've kept the same staffing numbers for at least the last 2 decades that I know of, with some variations in it. When the mass exodus occurred of the baby boomers, we went down to a staff of about 23, and it was a little bit harder to run the county with that number of people. Mr. Graham.
Appraisers with your office, are they licensed the same as a private practice?
They are not. So the state requires specific certifications to exist for our real estate appraisers, and the coursework comes from them, the testing comes from them, and the continuing education comes from them as well. So a little bit different, though we do have some of our appraisal staff members who do have a fee license as well if they're still maintaining it. He's not apparently maintaining it still. So the assessment roll this year was a good solid 4.9% growth, which we've had now 5 very consistent years of solid growth. And while that's a great thing, especially during some of the years when the market was down and there was very little growth that occurred, always an inverse trend that could occur there, because it doesn't always continue to go up. And that's kind of going to be a theme in today when it comes to the assessment roll and some of the things going on. What's interesting to me is you've got basically $7 billion of increase that occurred over that 5 years. So, and interestingly enough, the 2% increase that the state mandated this year was basically $660 million of that. So a large portion of it coming from just that 2% increase that we've seen. That number has also been influenced, I think, this year by the return of value to the roll from the value reduction program that we operate annually. So you're seeing, as the market recovers, you're seeing more and more properties return to their factor base year value, aiding to that $34.7 billion that occurred this year. So of that $34.7 billion, the division of it looked kind of like this year. And our county's an interesting one. So for the number 2 agricultural county in the United States, it is apparently, for tax purposes, more profitable to plant homes than trees. And so a very large portion of our property tax roll is residential properties. The agricultural properties continue to be a very consistent, almost $6 million, and it's been that way for several years. There really wasn't a lot of change in the general makeup of the breakdown of what is influencing the assessment roll in our county, though there were some interesting things in each individual category. So I want to go over each one of those by type with you and kind of walk you through a history in the last 5 years of what's occurred so that you can see some of the trends we're dealing with. So individually, residential parcels are what you would normally expect. The values continue to go up generally over the last 5 years and are, like we talked about in the last slide, almost $20 billion of the assessment roll. The number of parcels continue also to increase on the same scale. So this is, I think, what everyone would generally expect from a real estate market that appears to be healthy at this point. The commercial properties are an interesting one, and on this slide is something that you guys actually did that influenced it. So you'll notice in the second graph on the assessed value that last year's assessment actually went down, and which is not typical of the market where we're seeing consistency. And what that was the Saputo appeal. So as that was decided and we did the correction on it, it actually had a pretty significant impact on the property tax roll just with that one assessment. And by the way, that appeal is coming back before you sometime soon, so not that you keep that in mind, but just be aware it is a very serious case. So agricultural properties, kind of what you would expect as well, not a large variation in the total number of parcels, and the assessed value continues to tick up just like the assessment roll has in the last 5 years. Multifamily properties are basically done the same thing. Very little variation in the number of parcels. While the one graph on the left looks dramatic, if you look at the difference in the numbers there, it's really the difference of between 7 and 8 parcels, depending on the year. So, Proposition 8, it's something that we do outside of the assessment appeals process, and there are 2 different avenues the taxpayer can actually receive relief from us. One of them is requesting relief, and the other is an assessor-initiated program. So 10 years ago, when we were starting to deal with the effects of the market collapse, we went through and designed a statistical model that we can use to go through and derive a value for all single-family properties in the bounds of the cities within our county. And so we go through every year and come up with a value for it, compare it to the base year value, and then roll the lower of those 2 without the taxpayer being asked. And this year, that particular program on the left-hand side of your screen was a $772 million reduction. Probably the smallest number of properties, though, that we actually saw in the last several years receiving a reduction. And so that continues to, or as that continues to drop, I think what we're starting to see is maybe a flattening of that return of value, which could mean that ultimately in the long run, the board could be facing more assessment appeals as we move forward. In my tenure doing the chief appraiser's position, when I started 8.5 years ago, there were roughly 3,500 appeals to be worked compared to what we currently have in the hopper. So maybe kind of look at some of those as an indication of what's coming for us. When a taxpayer does request a value reduction, though, or a property does not meet the constraints of that statistical program because it's, say, commercial or a rural property where finding some type of a statistical model to run those values through is not possible, we actually have to do an individual appraisal on it. And there are 2,000 or so odd properties we did that to this year. And the big difference between the 2 of them, if you look at the average reduction between both, so it's really indicative of the type of property receiving that reduction because there's a $200,000 difference between the 2. And so there really is a lot more of the high-value commercial in that right-hand column. So touching, though, on our assessor-initiated relief, and it's something that impacts what occurs here very dramatically for you guys. Over the last 8 years, the values in that particular program that we've pulled off the tax roll were at a high of $3 billion and down to the low that we currently see. And the sum of those figures right there is $18.4 billion in tax relief for the general taxpayer due to the assessor's initiated relief. And you look at that 1%, that means there's $184 million the taxpayers of this county did not have to pay in property taxes rightfully because we're stepping out and being proactive about providing relief rather than have it show up here on your doorsteps to decide. So assessment appeals, though, being a highlight for what you guys do, and which is when someone can't resolve something with us, they come to you to have some type of resolution. And the workload compared to the 3,000 plus appeals that I started with is down to 67 total appeals that we know of to date, unless there are other applications that have been filed since the beginning of the July 2nd filing period. And I gave a little graph there showing the history of what's going on and talking about maybe indications of what's occurring in the market. From 14 and on, there's really almost a flat line for how many assessment appeals are being filed. And I think in that you can derive some type of impression about the taxpayers' feeling on the total value of their property. So we could be seeing the indications of a market that is maybe starting to plateau a little bit. The general work that we're going to work in our particular office in handling this year is trying to get these 67 or so odd cases solved this calendar year as a whole. And the Saputo one, like we talked about, is coming back to you relatively shortly for some type of resolve, so just kind of give you a heads up on that. But obviously, part of the reason why there is so few cases to show up here for, and hopefully we continue this trend for as long as we can. For the farmers in the group, I thought I'd touch on some of the Williamson Act highlights. So the Williamson Act doesn't make up an overly large portion of our role. As you saw, it's compared to the $19 million of residential properties and that $6 million of agricultural properties. The Williamson Act only makes up a small portion of those agricultural properties. And so it doesn't really have a huge impact on the overall tax roll, though there are huge impacts for the farmers who support the residential properties and other subsequent types. The last year, we basically reduced, for this year, we reduced the property taxes for those particular farmers under that act by $3 billion. Citrus still remains the number one crop in our county at $278 million of assessment. And I'd actually give anyone $1 if they can name the lowest valued crop in the Williamson Act. Mr. Fowler looks like he's guessing strawberries, but believe it or not, it was quinces this year. So we've got 32 assessment types, and so of those, quinces only came in at a very paltry, like $178,000 in assessed value. So obviously not a very popular crop here. So moving on to business and personal property. A lot of work is being done in this section. Mr. Beagle took over, 3 years ago, and in his effort to try to go through and regulate some of what was going on in there, we've made some significant changes. And a lot of it's been getting rid of what I'm going to call delinquent assessments. And the big number on that particular slide is the one on the far right-hand side at the bottom. And so when we annually send out the 22,000 plus property statements that we send out, anybody who does not file, in the past what we have done as an organization is go through and make an estimation of an assessment for them, put it on the tax roll whether the business was open or not. And that's not a practice that we're continuing on with. We're systematically going through, and that number used to be more than 5,000 properties or assessments that we weren't getting a response from, that we're individually working through to still see if the businesses are open. So if they're not, we can go ahead and close that assessment, no longer mail out that statement. Because the hard part with business and personal property, if we run on like that, that person's gone out of business and is not worried about the tax bill accruing for them. That eventually goes to a lien, and that individual has to come in and settle that at some point in time. And so we've been working very diligently to try to be proactive in that area as well, to make sure that they don't have to come in and argue a case when they're trying to buy a home or a car or something like that. So we're trying to minimize that particular non-filer bunch. The other thing, too, is doing things like getting rid of boats that no longer possess value. They outed 420 boat assessments this year, and I would have to assume the majority of those look like an aluminum John boat that someone purchased 30 years ago that we've just kept on the tax roll. And so we're really trying to make an effort to get things down to the core work that we need to do this coming year. We were able to mail out 145 less property statements this year, which was good. And in our work with the taxpayers, we actually had 582 more returned to us, which means we're getting better at either communicating with the taxpayer or at least doing things like reflecting the change in mailing addresses that occur. So an interesting highlight that I want to go over is just legal changes that we're seeing, and that's something that I think is going to play a role in ultimately what you do. But also, the far right column has got Proposition 5 as it currently stands that will be on your November ballot, and you get to vote for. So the first two, though, are the ones that we have seen come back in the last several years. I've seen two bills now try to work themselves through the Assembly and to adjust the homeowner's exemption. And our homeowner's exemption was established in '72, and they set the value at $7,000. In 1972, I'm sure that was a very large portion of your $35,000 home, but they pegged that number and never adjusted it as inflation occurred and as home values went up. So you get a $70 reduction as it currently stands, but the impact of that is minimal compared to a median home price now of roughly $250,000. So AB 1922, they're looking to double that particular reduction and looking at actually pegging it with some type of CPI increase annually. So the efficacy of that reduction will continue to grow as long as the CPI causes it to go up, which is a darn sight better than pegging it at $7,000 and letting it sit there. The first bill that they brought forward was actually $25,000, but it got mired down in committee and killed because they attached so much additional legislation to it that it became something nonsensical at the end. Split roll now is something that individually I've seen 3 years in a row coming, and I'm sure Mr. Graham is very familiar with it, but split roll is something that as the board, if it occurs, it will have significant impacts, at least in our mind, for what occurs in here. if they go through and separate commercial properties from Prop 13 and do a cyclical reappraisal, you're going to see every tax rep in the state filing on every commercial property every year because there'll be a big financial advantage for them in it. And I think you're going to see the commercial owners being willing to do so to try to stave off some of the effects of what are going to be wildly increasing and changing property taxes for them. As the bill currently stood that they just tabled, they won't be bringing to you, they're setting up a $2 million threshold. So if you are a commercial property owner, you have to own more than $2 million of commercial real estate in the state in order to be subject to split roll. If you had less than $2 million, you would be exempt from the split roll and you would stay with your Prop 13 protections. And you should read in that there will have to be a very large governmental bureaucracy to track every single ownership of every single property and its use throughout the state. And so I think you're looking at an increase in the hardship of taxpayers because bureaucracies are not efficient. So who's subject to that could be a very difficult thing. They're looking at a 3-year cycle for reappraisal. The interesting thing, too, is they're looking at exempting $500,000 of business property or below. So if you have less than $500,000 in that property, it's no longer assessable, which means Tom would be out of a job and would be looking for something to do. So if you would be so kind of split roll passes to reach out to him. Prop 5, though, is one you will vote on this November, and it has a lot of benefits for those of us who are getting older. Right now, currently in California, if you are going to transfer your base year value, you can do it if you're over 55, if you're doing it for a property that is of equal or lesser value, and you can do it primarily within the same county because outside of the county, it would take an inter-county agreement, and most counties at the coast currently don't want to accept our base year values because of the wide differences. Prop 5 actually guts pretty much most of that, and it makes it almost a free-for-all, which is an amazingly good thing for taxpayers over the age of 55. The one-time transfer qualification goes away, so once you establish your base year value, you can literally transfer it to every property you move to after you turn 55, if it's advantageous for you. It takes away the equal or lesser qualification, so I could sell my house in Three Rivers, take my base year value with me to the coast as I move into my $1 million beachfront mansion. It also removes the within the same county qualification, which would mean you could literally move your base year value anywhere. And so if you are over the age of 55 or getting close to it, I would advise buying a property in Alpaugh, establishing a base year value, and then shopping that property throughout the state as this gets passed, because I do think there's a big probability you'll see Prop 5 amend that legislation currently. The bottom point there adds new calculations. I ran through the bill and its text, and there's interesting scenarios that occur for properties that are of lesser value. There is the potential, based on the value of the base year value, to actually, after they enact this, when you transfer it, to end up paying less taxes than you started with in your original property. And I would have gone through the mechanics of the math in it, but it probably would have bored everyone to sleep, so we'll stay away from that. So last but not...
Who's arguing for that? Or, where did that come from?
There was an individual taxpayer down in Southern California who decided that this ballot initiative needed to occur. And I don't know if they were over 55 or what motivated, but they are moving that thing forward right now. It has some great implications if you're looking to transfer the base year value, though.
Any feedback on the split roll? Is it getting support? Or
Our concern is I think it actually is going to garner enough support eventually to make it to the ballot. And what they did with it this last year, it was really interesting to me because they framed it well. It was the California, I think it was Local Communities and Schools Funding Act. I mean, they essentially should have gone through and called it, School Children and Puppies, Act of 2018. They're really pandering to people to vote for it. The other thing they're selling in it is that it targets primarily these big evil business owners who have more than $2 million of property in the state. And when it comes down to it, Ms. Graham, you were well aware, even in our own county, $2 million of commercial property is not hard to come up with to then get yourself into a place where you're getting into a cyclical reappraisal. And I think that the fact that most individual voters only own their own homes, it'd be something that they would look at and go, well, why not pass it? It's going to benefit small children and puppies, and it's not going to impact me. And so we're seeing a lot of support, we think, at the state level for it, although the Assessors Association is definitely fighting against it.
Yeah, it's a kind of a complex matter for the whole general public to vote on. You know, I don't know that they really would understand all the implications of it, but
I don't think so either. And the variability for commercial properties after that, I mean, if you're trying to lease something and as a contingent you don't know what property taxes are going to be in the next year, how do you enter into a lease outside of a year to year?
right.
It's an interesting perspective. So I want to highlight 4 things that we're doing this coming year that you'll see the outcome of here, probably in the reduction of the number of people who have to appear in front of you. We enacted electronic recording this year, and so for our recorder's office, we are now reaching out to each individual title company and or bank one at a time to bring them on board with electronic recording. And this particular program is providing a lot of efficiencies because currently in our office, when you come with a recorded document, you actually bring a paper copy in, we record it, image it, index it, and then send you back the paper copy. With electronic recording, you literally send a digital file to us with the document in it, and we're able to index it instantaneously and then just email it back to the same person. So we've chosen to do one entity at a time to make sure the rollout of this particular program goes well, but our goal is by the end of this year, beginning of next year, have all of that, all the local vendors that would use that on board and moving that way. We're going through and continuing to look at the non-filers, so we're going to continue to audit business accounts that appear to be closed and try to close those assessments. The big one, though, that we're moving to the Board of Supervisors, and hopefully it's in 2 hearings that we'll have that accomplished, which is adjusting the minimum value resolution. So in our county, there was an ordinance in 1981 put into place that said if the assessment doesn't equal enough to pay for the cost of making it, we don't do it. And that number was determined to be $10 of value or $10 of tax dollars or $1,000 of value back in 81. And obviously at this point in time, the cost of our operations have gone up dramatically. And so we're going to look to move that particular value up to $5,000 this year with the board's approval. The impact of that wouldn't appear to be much, but of the 22,000 assessments that Tom has, 11,000 of those are actually less than $5,000, which means we are going to cut out 1/2 of the business and personal property assessments that we do because it doesn't make financial sense. When we looked at those 11,000 assessments, they only bring in $164,000 a year in property taxes. It costs us roughly $500,000 a year to collect that 164. So we're moving forward to the board to try to limit the impact of that and have that reduced. The other big thing that we're doing with going back to that first slide with the younger staff we have, we're really truly working on continuing education and training. We've done outreach with folks like you, Mr. Graham, and appreciative of that relationship, but looking to get our staff involved with local professionals to get a better feel of the market. So by the time they've dealt with the taxpayer, they're informed and well-trained. The other end of it, too, is just making sure that we get them to every state training and professional training we can. We are looking at doing things like Appraisal Institute classes for our real estate appraisers rather than just relying on the State Board of Equalization classes, which can be kind of anemic at times. So maybe kind of addressing, Mr. Graham, your question earlier. And individually, I just tell you, as a whole, as an office, we're taking a theme that is going to be greater efficiencies through training and tools this coming year. We're looking at still moving the property system project forward, even though there are some hardships in that. We're looking at going through and trying to develop a culture of customer service. And when I came on board, that was not what was done. It was a very adversarial relationship. You know, we were the almighty assessor, and how dare you challenge our values? And that's really not what we do now with our staff. We're hiring people specifically because of talents and also that characteristic of customer service. We really are, too, looking to be proactive and rather than reactive. And our push this coming year is to try to get out in front of things with additional programs, eliminate things that really don't need to be in our cadre of work. So expect to see those changes as our staff comes before you. And yes, they may have hipster beards and drink IPAs, but the work that they're doing is they're doing it at 25% greater level than the last generation that was in the office. So they are 25% more productive. And then on top of that, their understanding of real estate appraisal is vastly better than the previous generations. So expect to see some of those training or those issues as we go forward and actually finish up some of the training with our staff. That's all I had for you, though. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to answer them in addition.
There was talk at one time about changes of the reporting on the reporting end, software and things like that. I know some other counties you can report differently or do it online. Is that not even talked about, or is that kind of in the works? Or
Are you talking about filing for business property statements?
Yeah.
Yes, we are actively pursuing it because Tom would like to stop keying every single one of those values in that you return every year. So we're on hold with our property system project. It has that electronic filing integrated with it. So you could go to that portal, push everything in, and then it would be done. We're running into a little problem because the vendor, we've discovered a portion of it's ghostware. And so they're currently working on trying to get Riverside up and going. And once that occurs, we're still looking at 18 months out before we get that integrated. So for sure in the future, we are moving towards that, whether it's with this current vendor and that continues on, or if we jump to another vendor. That kind of electronic filing is something we have to have. It's just the reduction in man labor hours is huge for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm sure the convenience for you and not having to send out large packets of paper would be good.
Right, yeah, exactly. Kings County does that now, I believe, online.
You ask a question I don't know.
Yeah.
I know their assessor is relatively proactive, and she was our former business chief.
Right.
So
Right.
I guess if anybody's doing it, she probably wants it. So
That's down the road a little ways, it sounds like. Yeah.
a little, but we're
Yeah.
definitely it's on the radar for us. Other questions? I can answer for the board. All right. Well, gentlemen, we appreciate the work that you do. If there's anything that we can ever do as far as an organization, let us know. Outside of that, I look forward to maybe doing this next year. We'll see.
I know I really appreciate the work that everybody has done, and since I've been on the board, the work levels for us have been tremendously smaller, and it really is a detriment, or not a detriment, but a great asset that you guys are doing to help that taxpayer and get those reduced values. So I have definitely seen that since I've been on the board. You guys have been doing a great job, so I appreciate that.
We're trying. I mean, the old way we used to conduct business is not how we want to continue forward. So,
Right.
But I do think we're facing some interesting times as interest rates continue to go up. And I looked at affordability index numbers for housing recently, and they're just kind of, it's starting to reach that point where you can tell something either has to plateau and carry on, or it's going to go the other way. And I think with what the Fed's doing with the rates this year, we'll see some of that come back, which means we'll be here a lot, with
Right.
you guys. So,
Yeah.
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you again. Okay. Well, let's move on. We have agenda item number 3, a non-confirmed attendance for Target Corporation. Any word on where that's at?
We've heard nothing from them, but there's a little more to it than that, I guess.
Okay. Well, in terms of these applications, and that's the only one on our agenda, I would entertain a motion to deny for non-appearance agenda item number 3.
I'll make a motion to deny number 3 for non-attendance.
Do I have a second? Second. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And then we have the withdrawal calendar. Entertain a motion to accept the withdrawal calendar as stated.
Accept the withdrawal calendar as stated.
We have a second.
I'll second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. With that, it looks like we're done. Any other comments or concerns before we close the meeting? And we do not have a closed session item to talk about. Not? Meeting's adjourned.
How you coming on finding more board members?
Yeah. That's partially our job as well.
Yeah. Any suggestions?
Yeah, no further update on that at this time. As far as District 5, so
They could live in any district, basically. Yeah, we were talking. It would be nice to get an attorney on the panel as well. Oh, okay.
He would be a good one to have on.
Have you talked to him?
I talked to him a couple weeks back, and I think he's entertaining it.
Okay.
I don't think there would be any conflict having an appraiser on the board, right? Or is that an
No,
issue?
not at all. The only issue may be, a lot of times, Keith does a lot of work, and a lot of times his work may be up.
Well, that's what I think he was concerned about.
Yeah, but other than that,
I mean, he would just have to recuse
recuse
himself.
himself if that did happen.
Yeah.
And a suggestion, too, our former assistant assessor is actually going to be reaching the time period where he can serve on your board. And he's a relatively young guy in his early 50s, so between going to the gym and watching TV, I would imagine that this would be something that could be up his alley. And he did this career for like 28 years. So if the board's interested, I'd be glad to reach out with his phone number as well, and you can see if he has any vested interest in it.
Because I think George is just kind of waiting until we find somebody to replace him.